Okay, today we're going to be looking at four famous ancient Greeks: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Alexander the Great. So let's look at the star-studded lineup. First, you've got Socrates. His Socratic method is still used today in law schools and other places. Then his pupil, Plato. Then Plato's pupil, the famous Aristotle, who really is the foundation of most colleges even today in terms of what they study. And then Aristotle's famous pupil, Alexander the Great. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the trinity of Greek philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers, and then Alexander the Great, a general and a leader. So let's look at a little bit about each one of these philosophers taught. Socrates wrote no books, just like Jesus wrote no books. Buddha wrote no books, but great things came from them, and many people followed them, even though they themselves wrote no books. Plato wrote Socratic dialogues in which Socrates was in them, and so we know most of what we know about Socrates from what Plato wrote, not from what Socrates wrote. Socrates challenged the Sophists. They were a school of philosophers at the time of the Peloponnesian War that were very cynical and said you should just seek what's best for yourself and forget about altruism and virtue and doing good things. And Socrates said that was wrong. You know, Socrates is famous for having said, the unexamined life is not worth living. You need to examine yourself, live a just and righteous life. Then Plato, Socrates' school, Socrates' pupil, set up a school called the Academy. And that was in the latter part of his life. The academy didn't have any specific teachings that they taught, but they simply posed questions for others to answer. Plato did write a lot. Again, he wrote the Socratic dialogues where we learned about Socrates. He wrote a book called The Republic, which is still a famous book studied in political philosophy today. One of the main ideas in it, he said philosopher kings should rule. He said other forms of government like democracy, oligarchy, they fail because kings are ambitious and stuff, whereas philosophers, he implied, wouldn't become that way. So the ideal government is ruled by a philosopher king. Oddly, Plato said there should be no poets in this ideal republic. Kids would be raised communally. Deserving women should be given an education. That was a new idea for his time. So there's Plato, Socrates' student. And then Plato's famous student, Aristotle. Aristotle founded a school called the Lyceum, which believed in cooperative learning, and they studied basically practical things, history and science research. So these philosophers form the basis of modern science, because stop and think about it. They're in a time, ancient Greece, where the Greek gods, think of the Greek gods, Zeus and all the stories of these gods. These philosophers said that's ridiculous. Things don't happen because it's the whims of some crazy gods. We need to study. We need to use rationality. So the study and rational thinking form the basis of these philosophers, and so really they're the basis of like Western civilization or the scientific method. But then Alexander, who was a student of Aristotle, he's no longer a philosopher. He basically conquered the world, and so he put into practice perhaps some of the practical things learned from studying these philosophers. And of course, you can see in the background there the area that he conquered. Here's another picture of it there. The empire of Alexander the Great through Asia Minor and all the way to India. And here's the picture that appears in your textbook. So you can see Alexander basically conquered the world. He brought Grecian culture and learning to the east, but he also picked up Persian culture as he moved east. And so the culture that came from Alexander is called Hellenistic, where the Grecian philosophy, all the Grecian ideas of architecture and philosophy, while he spread those east, as Alexander moved east in his conquerings, he began to aggrandize or take to himself Persian customs. He even took a Persian wife. And so this blending of Greek ideas and Persian ideas and Indian ideas is called Hellenistic culture. This gives you an idea how big his empire was, superimposed over a map of the United States. So a huge empire founded by Alexander as a relatively young man. Socrates, as I said the unexamined life is not worth living. He challenged all around him to examine their beliefs and their ideas. He was put on trial for corrupting the city of Athens' youth, their young people, and also for failing to respect the gods. And as we said, these philosophers didn't, believe in these Greek gods. They believed in a reason and study. And so again, this is the roots of modern science. So when Socrates was condemned to death, there's a Socratic dialogue about this called the Crito, C-R-I-T-O, and Socrates is given a chance to escape, but he said, why would I escape? The government I believe in, the Athenian government, is what they think, justly condemn me, and I can't condemn the government that I've been grown up in and has been a source of help to me. And so if they say I must die, then I must die. And he drinks the poison, the hemlock. Plato left Athens for 10 years after the death of Socrates, striking thing that happened to him. When he returned, he set up the academy. His idea of forms is that everything that exists exists in its most pure form in heaven, let's say, in a form. So any horse is simply a reflection of the perfect ideal of a horse. Any chair, there's many different kinds of chairs, are all just various reflections of the perfect form of the chair. He emphasized the importance of reason. And in the Republic, we've talked about this, it said that the state should regulate citizens' lives. Children should be raised communally. There would be workers, soldiers, and then philosopher kings. And talented women would be educated. So Plato's book, The Republic. Then Aristotle analyzed governments, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, but he said democracy was the worst form of government. We think it's the best. He said it was the worst. It would lead to ultimately the lower classes getting what they want to. We'd be run by our lower nature, not by our higher nature, and mob rule would take over. So in the end, he favored rule by a single strong and virtuous leader, sort of like Plato did. People ought to live by the golden mean between the extremes. Don't be too spendthrift. Don't be, hold your pennies too much. Be in the middle. Reason should be the guiding force, as with all these philosophers. And the first universities in Europe, 1,500 years later, after Aristotle, were still based on Aristotle because he tended to study the practical arts. Here's a famous picture. It's called Raphael's School of Athens. And you can see in this picture Plato and Aristotle. See, Plato's pointing up, sort of like believing in his forms, in these ideal forms in theory. Aristotle's kind of pointing ahead and down, indicating science, leading the way in politics. And so here's the picture, and you can see Plato and Aristotle are at the center of the School of Athens. And then Alexander the Great conquers the world. He's not a philosopher. He's not arguing about forms. He puts onto the earth, into practice, the idea of trying to be the single great ruler. Of course, he wasn't a philosopher king. And so there's a quick look into Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and
Oh, baby, baby, it's a while.